Hi. I was, talking to some friends on Discord, and we were just talking about, the SCP Foundation. And if this reaches any sort of audience, I bet people will think, like, oh yeah, the SCP Foundation, that thing that was cool until kids came and ruined it, or whatever. I don't think that's the case. I'm not saying SCP is bad. I would definitely say that it sucks at the moment. But that's due to the nature of how people are treating the SCP Foundation nowadays, you know? Because I came to realize that, like, people don't really treat the SCP Foundation as a storytelling medium. You know how, like, the Gen 1 SCPs, SCP-001 to 1000, or whatever, they were all these really kind of menacing stories that were told through the medium of, this is a lab entry telling you what's going on with them, or trying to discern what's going on. It was a storytelling medium. One of my favorite SCPs, I think, was like 059 or something like that, where it's a dog that valiantly protects its owner, but it's a ravenous murder ghost dog that's barely alive. Speak of the devils. Anyways, stop. No. Fun fact, normally you can just tell a dog no and they'll stop. Not that time. But, what is it? Back to SCP. Because that was the point of me recording this. The SCP Foundation is treated like a content farm now. People write SCPs to make it big. I included. Like, a couple of years back, I made a couple of SCPs because I thought they'd be really, really cool or charming. But I realized they didn't really... I realize now that they didn't really tell stories. They weren't a storytelling medium, like all of the old SCPs were. Like all of the good SCPs were. Nowadays, SCP is treated as a way to make it big. Tell a couple things and you do big stuff. And I think a lot of, like, internet content creation is a partial cause to that. Because you know all those SCP Explain channels? You know all those people who just explain SCPs, but do it really badly? They treat it like it's a way to make it big. They treat it like a way to get attention. They don't treat it like they're reading from a story. It's so odd, you know? People make games of SCPs when I don't think that was the right way to express SCPs. Making them a game, it doesn't really tell a story. It makes you the story. It makes you. It focuses on yourself. It doesn't give any of that kind of, like, it doesn't give any way to really express yourself. Goddamn dogs. Or whatever. I presume the people watching this video get my point. The SCP Foundation is treated like a joke. It's treated like something that only kids do. But really, it's a storytelling medium. The entire website is like a storytelling medium of sorts. People People tell stories, they make stories, they share stories. That's what the SCP Foundation was built on at the start. But now it's just kind of nothing. It's just a way for big YouTubers to get a quick buck, and it's fostered this kind of relationship from other people, like kids or people who are trying to content farm themselves. Just in general, people trying to content farm, so that's a lot of kids, because kids have big aspirations. They really just want to do something with their life. And, you know, it's like, good for them. I would not bash I would say that an SCP made by a kid that's like one big murder monster is something that's like expected from a young writer. It's understandable, you know? But really all it does is feed into this cycle where people will make content about SCPs. People will make SCPs, and then those people will just get more content. It's just a big exponential content farm. And nobody cares about the story anymore. People will just say, hey, what if this thing existed? That's screwed up, huh? Like, I remember reading, I think it's SCP-5000. The one where the SCP Foundation suddenly turns on the world. And I feel like it's both the epitome of what the SCP Foundation should be and what it should not be. It's specifically trying to tell a story. It's trying to tell a big, grand story, full of menace and just everything that you would want out of an SCP tale. And I find that a really interesting aspect. SCP-5000 or 5001, I forget the difference. Or I forget which one's which. It's a very harrowing story that you never really get the answer to. It's just in the end where you're like, that could be something that happens. But in the end, that's not really the point of it. That's not really the point of it. The SCP Foundation talks about stories. It gives them a conclusion. And if it doesn't give them a conclusion, it talks about what happened after a story. That's what I feel like the best SCPs have done. They either tell a story or tell something that happened after a story. Things that happen in a story, it's just like, it's weird. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't work. And then the part about the SCP Foundation, like, another thing that I feel like has deteriorated the quality of SCP and the SCP Foundation is that what is it? People will try and expand the world, but they don't care about their own stories. They care about building atop others, which is why you get so much content about the big name SCPs. SCP like 682096173 yada 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 999001 when day breaks yada 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 3008. People make a bunch of stories about those, and they're doing it to, in a way, expand upon the world. Most people do it to be like, a funny game, which is going back on the game philosophy I said about the SCP Foundation. It's not a good way of telling the story mediums. The way that the SCP Foundation works, fundamentally, like early on, a lot of the best works were never really like that. They were telling the aftermath of stories. They told about the carnage of what they did. It talks about how a story ends. It's finality, conclusion. The SCP Foundation is a prison where things are supposed to be locked up for life. Why would you want to keep telling a story? You know? I guess there's the thrill of escape, thrill of breaking out and doing who God knows what. Even not God. God's an SCP, you know? The SCP Foundation is ruined by the people who don't see it as a storytelling medium. They see it as a way to get big. It's all you have to do is write a couple words, you know?